Good morning, fellas. And once again, Vince, thanks for bringing up that whole idea of the supplemental material. We walked through that, and that as occasion arises, I'll create little pages like that for explanation. We are now in a very technical section that has dramatic, however our whatever our where we've landed, a section that has dramatically affects how we view God, the cross, others, and our faith in Christ. It's not everyone lands on the same page here, and so as we get into these various topics, I'll create little one pagers that are hopefully not biased. I'm trying to give information that then you can take and decide what you want to how you want to adopt this nuance or whatever we're talking about. The whole intent here is to try to the best we can living in the year 2025 to go back and try to understand this to some degree of how the early church understood this. And so that is the driving motivation here. And I realize we're limited because we can't go into their skin, but we can attempt to the best of our ability. So, and this morning is a case in point because, well, let me enter into it. Jesus is crucified at the time of Passover. That's a known fact. And I don't think it's by accident. I want to believe in a God who is present and a God who is communicating to humankind, like we all do. And I believe that Jesus at the Passover is significant in concert with who I understand God to be. So we've got 12 through 15 in chapter 19. And we're going to look at this over the course of today and next week. And then is verse 16 where it says, and he crucified him. And it's for this reason that I sent those papers out last week, because I'm going to be using technical terminology. And if you consult those resources, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Otherwise, the subpoints and the bunny trails will just go off in all directions. So that's why we have these papers. So let's begin. The season of release, and that's the time of year in the Jewish calendar where the people of the Jewish faith, the Israelites, celebrated God as the one who releases, and the festival is the Passover. So in 12 through 15, what we're seeing in a very broad context is humanity judges the king. And it reads, as a result of this, and that would be Pilate's interaction with Jesus. Pilate made an effort to release Jesus, but the Jews shouted, saying, if you release this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. They really tightened the screws. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement. Any of you been to Jerusalem, they've got this historically that you can visit. It's covered over today, but it's suggested here that this pavement, this stone pavement, this place that would be the courtroom, was an open area. How the Jews, being outside, interacted with Pilate and what was going on the inside is subject to interpretation, and there's a lot of different ideas that we won't go into. In the Hebrew, it's called Gabbatha, the pavement. It was the day of preparation for the Passover. There's that word. It was about the 6th hour. Depending on the Jewish calendar or the Roman calendar, it was either 6 o'clock would be 6 a.m., or according to the Roman calendar, 6 a.m., or according to the Jewish calendar, it was noon. So depending on your view, I kind of think it was earlier rather than later. He said to the Jews, "Look, your king." So they shouted, "Away, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answers, "We have no king except Caesar." There is so much irony within this short 3 verses, and we hope to look at that over the course of today and next time. But to begin, John the author embeds the Passover detail within the narrative for the trial. He does that. And so I want to believe that he did that for a reason. He was trying to communicate something, and so we're going to begin there. And the reason we begin there is to frame what is about to occur, the actual crucifixion itself. Because as we now, this is an important statement because we're going to tie this back later. We're going to tie in this session, we're going to talk about the Passover being embedded into John's narrative. Why that is, because how you and I think of the Passover is how we think of the cross, and how we think of the cross is how we think of the Passover. And that's why we're going to begin here. So Passover in the Hebrew is Pesach. And the idea of Pesach in the Hebrew Bible means God's presence to protect. That's the idea. God's like a hovering parent or a guardian at the door. The idea of Pesach is God's protection, God's protection. It was the day of the preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Look, your king." We're going to just land on this verse for today, and we'll take the remainder next week. John has pointed out that this occasion occurs at the season of Passover. Let's fill in some details in regard to how this season was perceived by the Jews of the Old Testament and by the first century Jews. Because if we understand Passover, it's going to help us understand the cross. That's the idea. When the people of the first century thought of Passover, they thought of the terms release or rescue. That's a critical component. God releasing the people or rescuing the people. Now, a side note that we could really go down a bunny trail on is Pilate's declaration, where he says, "Behold your king." He has no idea what he's talking about, but Jesus is the king. And it's what the people have done to the king that is monumental. And Jesus's response within that. So we could talk for a long time about that, but it's no accident. Behold, look at your king. Their remembrance the Jews, the people present at this moment, as they're preparing for Passover, their remembrance was about God hearing the cry of the people at the first Passover and moving towards them to rescue. It was all about rescue. Now we transpose that, or we move forward, fast forward to today, and this festival is celebrated every year. And I know our Dave Brown will often invite us in the spring to a Passover meal, a Pesach meal. And at that meal, it's the same throughout and has been throughout history. And so since the time of the beginning of the Passover celebration, the current and every generations since has been told, see yourselves as if you came out of Egypt. That's an important distinction. The people celebrating Passover get together as families and they remember God's deliverance and rescue from Egypt. That's the point. This is how every generation has understood Passover, and that is God's act, not just once, but continually to liberate from bondage. It ties to the character of God. God is the deliverer, according to the Passover meal. Now, here's a note. This is how the Jews of the time at hand that we're reading, and this is how the early church, the very early church, understood the cross event as God's rescue. And I'm tying Jesus's words, if the Son sets you free, you will be free, to that idea. It's the idea of release from bondage. So God rescues because this is who God is, according as celebrated by the Passover meal. Passover is about deliverance from. And you guys, well, why is he beating this into the ground? Well, just bear with me for a minute, because because it's how we perceive it. The defining verb in Exodus is to bring out, yasha, which is Hebrew liberation from bondage. God is going to bring them out of bondage. And that's the idea. And the same root is used in our term Yeshua, Jesus, and the scripture refers to Jesus as our Passover, the one who delivers us from bondage. So it's not a new idea, it's a continuation. And Jesus is in the Passover, and the Passover we see as a picture of Jesus. And I think you guys, of course, you guys know that. God acts because he hears the cry of the oppressed. Okay, Ken, just bear with me. I know I'm really beating a dead horse here, but just bear with me. So the key idea is Passover reveals God's, and I would say eternal disposition towards freedom and human flourishing. That is how I have come to understand the God we worship. Is that God is with us and God is for us. Now, here is where it starts to get interesting. English translators, Tyndale, 1530, King James folks, 1611, they chose the term Passover. Passover and Pesach don't mean the same thing. Pesach is God's hovering presence to deliver. What they chose in the English when they translated Passover was the idea, the emphasis of the story on the destroyer passing over. You know, in the original Passover, they were to apply blood, and then the angel of death would pass over, skipping those people. That's in the story. But in the original, and so they translated it Passover, the angel of death passing over. But this was not based on the Hebrew word Pesach. The idea of Pesach was God's rescuing. The passing over of the angel of death was a part of the story, but it wasn't the emphasis of the story. The English translators made that they made that the emphasis of the story. So they they interpreted Pesach as passing over, but it doesn't have any direct correlation to the word, but it's how they understood the event. The idea of the blood applied, and that God would then overlook them and pass over, and they would go free. And those are two entirely different meanings. The original idea was God is rescuing the people out of bondage, but the English translators translated as, well, the means by which you do that is you apply the blood and God overlooks you and you're set free. Excuse me. The idea when they did that, it's because how they understood it. Remember how the cross influences how you view Passover, and the Passover affects how you view the cross. The idea in the 15th, 16th century stuck, and it's what the Reformed people believed. And this idea, the idea of the blood applied, so God sets you free, has stuck ever since. And it's dramatically influenced our segment of the church, which is like this. And then here's a direct quote from the Abraham Herschel Center, a Jewish quote, how the Jews looked at it and how they look at it today. This is a continuous how Passover is viewed. Passover, you'll still see, they'll still use that word because they don't mean the same thing, but they refer to the same thing. Passover or Pesach is a time of celebration of freedom and faith, and God himself shows up as the deliverer. That's the core idea. Now, what about the blood? Okay, we have been taught in probably all of our traditions how to think about Passover in reference of how we've been taught to think about the cross. Blood is applied, but here, blood is applied as participation. And let me continue. The blood in Exodus is described in the text as a sign for you. And so what does that mean? The blood was applied, this is a side note, and sometimes we get this confused. The blood was applied only once at the first Passover that we read about in Exodus. As the Jews practiced that throughout history and today, they don't kill an animal. The animal, there's no blood applied on the doorpost. That was a one-time event. And the animal was part of the meal. The goat, it was killed and was present in the meal as part of the meal, and the blood from that animal was placed on the doorpost, which I want to believe would have been a common way to identify during that time. I'm not equipped to even speak into that, but we know that's what God told the people to do. The important point here is that the blood was applied once and wasn't repeated annually from thereafter. And I am proposing that the blood is not an appeasing tool so God will turn his head and not judge the people, but the blood was applied as a sign for participation. Families had to choose to identify with God's release at the moment, and they did so by faith. They weren't released yet, but it was an adoption or adherence to what God was saying, and they chose to identify with that liberation to freedom, this hope, and they did so through marking their thresholds. The blood marks the household as belonging to the liberating movement of God. It's a choice they made. Say, I'm going to go with this. We as a family want to move. We want to be free. Participation says, I identify with God's liberating act. And of course, there's correlations to the gospel. I got to stay on track here. Okay, now here's a direct quote from a rabbi of how the Passover, how the blood is perceived, or how the night of Pesach was perceived. The night of Pesach was the night of choice, and it brought the people to a decision point. Do you want to be a Jew, or do you want to be an Egyptian? And tonight is the showdown. That is how it was basically understood. Either to identify with God's liberating act through faith, or I'm going to stick the way it is. The idea of blood application as a means to satisfy a divine requirement. The idea that it became payment for sin. That God needed the people to do this act so God could save them. That idea, fellas, was induced into the church in the 16th century. It wasn't part of for 1600 years. This was and my papers talk about that. It's a way of thinking that we've all been dramatically influenced by. This way of thinking is rooted, first of all, in the 11th century satisfaction theory, of course, referring to the paper. And it's the idea, fellas, that God needs something so he can forgive. God needs blood so he can forgive. That idea was started to flow in the church in the 11th century, and they later became what we call the penal substitutionary atonement, the idea of blood sacrifice, and God will overlook you. As that was through Calvin in the 16th century. But it was in no way, fellas, no way a part of what John is talking about here. The English writers and the reformers and how we have been influenced causes us to focus on Passover as, okay, well, blood is necessary. And we see that in the Passover, that when the angel of death goes by, he sees the blood, he goes, okay, you're cool, or you can live. We have been taught to think that way, but that wasn't part that wasn't part of the original church for 1600 centuries. And so let's move on. Passover was to be the idea of reference or rescue and release and ongoing identity. This is really important. Each generation is commanded to see itself as it personally came out of Egypt. That is part of the Pesach meal. And it's to reverence God as the one who delivers us from ourselves. To deliver, well, in that case, Egypt. Freedom is not a one-time event. It's a continuing identity. In many of our systems, we've created coming to salvation in Christ is a one-time event, but then what do I do? It's a continual identity of identifying with God and who he is and what God is doing in and through our lives. The annual meal rehearses belonging to God's liberating story. Participation means living as released people who now release others. By the way, fellas, I'm using the word participation for a specific reason. And you'll see that as we develop this framework for understanding the cross, or how I understand the cross, participation is a really big word. But participation means living as released people who now release others. Many of us wonder, well, what were the Jews all about? What were they supposed to do? And here it is. The key idea that in the Jewish tradition, liberation from Egypt is not freedom for its own sake. We don't just take it and hoard it, but freedom for covenant, the covenant with God, the call to live meaningfully, justly, and in harmony with others. That's what the Jewish call was all about. The people of Israel were never sent out to convert the world. We wonder that. Well, why didn't they convert people to Judaism? They didn't think that way. They were there to bless the world, as through Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, the promise we've talked about. And they were to be a blessing to others, to be a light among nations through how they live, not what they proclaim. It is us who took the idea of the gospel, the good news, and defined it the way that we choose to define it, and it became a content-oriented faith of affirming through a belief system, and now you're in. The Jews didn't think that way. It was through their life living in the here and now, and how that can affect others, and being released from bondage. Now, let's take, with this basis, let's look at the incarnation parallel, because it's not a new deal. Like, I don't believe God is the one to say, well, that didn't work, let's try this in a theological sense. No, it's a continuation, and there's parallel between what we see in the Passover and the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The incarnation, God again crosses the threshold to join humanity, and I'm taking some liberty there with threshold. But God entered human flesh. The Word became flesh through the incarnation. And God is crossing and moving towards release by being present with the people. And that's what's pictured in the Passover. And this is how I understand the biblical phrase in Galatians, in the fullness of time. I've always wondered about that, what that means. It could be interpreted in numerous amounts of ways, but I view it as a time in history where God chose to be with us in flesh. Jesus's life embodies, now this is important, Jesus's life embodies what the Passover blood symbolized, presence. The idea of blood in the Passover, the blood on the doorpost represented the presence of the animal for what God had instructed the people to do, presence. Here, the incarnation embodies what the Passover blood symbolized, and that's God's present with and for his people. God enters human flesh. The Word became flesh. This is a way to understand life in the blood. We have taken that, or others who have taught us, the idea that God, it's a trigger. The blood is some sort of device that when it's released, God can forgive. That is the term appeasement, that something in God needs to be appeased before he can forgive. And that's one way to understand life in the blood. I don't particularly share that. It's the way the life itself is symbolized in the blood. The blood is a symbol, actually, more accurately, the blood is symbolic of a life. And so it's the entire life of Jesus, not just the cross. And guys, Jesus's word in Corinthians, do this in remembrance of me. He's pointing to the entire incarnation, the person of God's presence with us. And the cross itself is a portion of that. This is my body, which is broken for you. But it's this entire body, and it's you could possibly think, well, what's the big deal? Because we focus in on the cross. I'm not opposed to that, but it's really the idea of incarnations, God's presence with us, and that how I was taught, that really wasn't talked about. It was all about the cross, the focus on the cross. And where I am today is I think a lot is missing from that understanding if we don't embrace the entire incarnation of who he is, how he interacted, what he represents. The mark of belonging at Passover, the blood, or the act of belonging at communion, symbolized by the bread and the wine, it's all about relationship. It's not obligatory. It's not something I need to do in order for God to pass over. That is how many of us, that's how I viewed the Passover for years. And I no longer share that, or I no longer hold that position. But it's all about adhering to a relationship, not carrying out an obligatory act so I can, it'll save my skin. It represents the indwelling presence of God, and that God, like always, is here to rescue. By the way, that is how the early church understood the idea of salvation. They didn't have atonement theories like I've given you. That developed later. They just call it, and this is the Orthodox Church, that they still believe this, that it's God's rescue act, God rescuing us. And it's been like that for 2,000 years. The ways of thinking about the cross developed later. So thus we acknowledge this idea of rescue is the key idea. The Word became flesh. So within that, we interpret that as God, the eternal Word, identified and fully participated with human flesh, becoming what we are. The key idea here is the Passover doorpost prefigures the doorway of incarnation. God with us to liberate us. That's the idea. It's the entire life, not just death, which is, it's his entire life, not just his death, which is to be focused, not to minimize his death by any means. So why is this important? Well, it's vitally important. Number one, the Jewish meaning, if we go to what the Jews believed at the time of the New Testament and what the early church then adopted, Passover celebrates participation, a people stepping into God's deliverance, not performing an act so God can accept them. That came later. Now, because this is such a big pill to swallow by all of us, I had to put some clout in there just to show you that this isn't, I'm not off my rocker here. Modern scholars, including people that you know, like N.T. Wright, C.S. Lewis, Karl Barth, Dallas Willard, Walter Brueggemann, whoever you read, you've heard of these names. They as a whole, and you can source this, they as a whole interpret God's redemptive movement through the cross events, including the Passover. They include it as harmonizing it, not as a transaction, an appeasement for divine wrath, but as an act of liberation and transformation. That's how they view it. The blood in the Passover story is entirely a sign of identification with God's freeing presence. God does not stand apart demanding anything, but he enters the story of bondage to bring freedom from within. And this is setting the stage for what we're going to talk about. Conclusion: to understand the doorposts of Passover as prefiguring the doorway of incarnation, and I took liberty there, doorpost, doorway, is to understand God's crossing the threshold into human bondage through the incarnation to dwell with us and bring liberation from within, a presence to transform us. That's I worked hard on that paragraph. So the bridge to next week. As we have discussed, God rescues, and I believe that is because who God is. And then from Egypt to Pilate's court, God's action is to set free. That's the belief that I have. God's action is to set free. The Passover sign marked participation. Those who marked their door stepped into God's deliverance as an act of trust. However, on the flip side, in John 12 through 15, of which we'll look at in full next week, what we're seeing, fellas, is the tragic and blurred reversal. And what's ironic in John's writing is that Passover, which we just did a quick overview, is in direct contrast to what we see happening in the human condition. Humanity is gripped by fear and allegiance to human clout. That's what we've been seeing. And humanity is choosing self-imposed bondage over freedom, collapsing into the heap of rubble, the very thing Christ came to liberate. So what we see happening is what Jesus is coming to save. This is the self-destructive spiral Jesus steps into. He doesn't crush it from the outside, top down, but absorbs it from within, carrying our collapse into his own body. That is really a key. We'll talk more about this, but many of us perceive the cross as a more powerful God acting to overcome and to with a bigger hammer. That is how I don't see it like that. I see that that's what we expect by being human, because that's how we perceive power. But it's actually a collapse. Jesus is allowing the system to collapse, and we're going to talk way more about that and what it means for us. Next week, we'll see the same God of rescue revealed in full, love entering the ruins, not to condemn the world, and that's his direct quote, but to heal it from the inside out. Now, I took a long time. This is a very technical, we're on a technical ride here. And on our opening slide, we proposed that how we think about the Passover is how we think about the cross. And I think you guys can understand why I said that. And we've seen how interpreters in the past history, they actually, in the word itself, Passover, is emphasizing the point of the angel of death, where in the original idea of Pesach, it wasn't It was about God's rescue. As we think of the cross is how we think of Passover. For many of us, it's second nature to think of Passover as God's wrath being turned away by blood. I get that. I fully get that. We've heard it, we're taught it, we sung it, we have sung it, it's in our hymns, it's all over in our hymnology, and we've affirmed it for years. But in the Jewish story, the blood wasn't about appeasement. It marked participation in God's act of deliverance. And that's the point of this session. And now, guys, I'm putting some humor in this. So bear with me here. I found this picture that I think is kind of funny. Asking to consider it this way can feel like a big pill to swallow, and I understand that. And but yet I want you to know my only intent is to invite us to take a second look. Not that I need people to believe my way, but we're trying to look at this through what the early church, what John was communicating, and hopefully that the early church would understand. And that's my focus every week. However, by looking and willing to take a second look, which requires humility for some of us, well, it always requires humility to take a second look. But I have no idea what your frameworks are. The reason is that it may just have bearing on how we view God, ourselves, others, and this wonderful gift that we all share is called life. Now, a lot of technical stuff this morning, fellas, and we've got about 10 minutes, or maybe a little more. So I have hit you, not intentionally, but with a lot of different ideas that could really be in contrast to what your thoughts are, or what, how you've always perceived it. And I get that. So I'd like to know what your comments or your questions, what comments or questions do you have at this juncture?
My head's spinning.
Some of the opinions that we have learned from our pastors and from our church denominations and stuff are not without evidence. I mean, Leviticus 17:11, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. The whole book of Hebrews, we have a better sacrifice. I mean, all of this stuff, the timing of the day that Jesus Christ was killed as when the Passover lamb was slain. I mean, there's analogy through the Bible, and the fact that someone said, and I don't know the authority of this someone said that the Jews of the first century did not believe that. I have no idea if that's even true.
Right.
And neither does the person who said that, unless he's very, very old.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, people come up with all kinds of stuff that's colored by modern thought. That N.T. Wright says anything has no authority to me whatsoever. I know who he is. He's got a cool voice. He sounds like he knows what he's doing. He's English, so certainly, I mean, he's on, they put English guys on BBC, so they must be correct. Just like all of these atonement theories, which we have many, as you showed us, Mike,
yeah,
are opinions after the fact, trying to make sense of the historic reality of Jesus Christ dying on the cross. There is no contention that he did. There's opinion as to why he did and what actually was accomplished when he did. And what those atonement theories try to satisfy.
Right.
This is another one, not that what you're bringing. The Jewish perspective is another one. It's like, well, we never really, in the beginning, we never really believed that God required the shedding of blood for the angel of death to pass over our home. What he really wanted was to be us to be true Jews. And it's like, what? I mean, Egypt was, forcing these guys to make bricks without straw. I don't think they had a choice. It's not an allegiance vow, but it is today. It is today with, Israel and Palestine and modern thinking, and we're the remnant, and so all of this stuff in my mind is opinion.
Yeah.
And will never be anything but opinion. And for me to take it as authority is a fool's errand. It's just opinion. I may latch onto one of them, and if it satisfies me for the rest of my life, then I'm in that camp. But to say that it's authority, I don't see how anybody could ever do it.
What you're saying is the same spirit of which I'm joining the ranks like everybody else, taking a stab at it from a finite mind. And so you're exactly right. What we do with it is what we all do with it.
Well, what I've come to, and it's sort of a defeatist attitude, maybe at my age, but what I've come to the conclusion is, since Vince, could never know actually what happened or the purpose of God, all I can do is I could study the various theories of church fathers as to what they think happened.
Right.
And if the way they explain it makes sense to me, then I'm in their school. And I go through life saying that Jesus Christ died as a substitute for my sin. And by the shedding of his blood, God accepted that sacrifice and calls me ceremonially clean. And I'm so glad. Another person can say something totally opposite of that. And if it makes sense to me, because I eschew violence, and I can't believe that God would require an innocent to die in my place, then I'll say, well, Jesus Christ was an exemplar. He was the example of what God intended humankind to be, and I should follow in his steps, and wear a bracelet. What would Jesus do? And that's why I'll live my life that way instead. Neither one of those is necessarily correct or necessarily wrong. It's just the way that I choose to live the remaining of my life.
Right. Yep, that's true. Thanks, Vince. I think Bill, you had a comment there.
Well, that speaks for me in terms of the fact that we make a decision based on what we think of God. I never thought about this at all until recently. Someone said, "Is God does God love me or does God hate me?" And the idea that God, which is would destroy me unless He has a sacrifice of sin, that starts to sound problematic. But it is what I want to accept. You're right. What speaks to you? But there's something that's flowing out of this. I mean, N.T. Wright's one of my heroes. So is Dallas Willard. So is Brueggemann. It's sort of like if when the Apostles' Creed came to existence, it was sort of like Christianity seemed to pivot from behavior to thinking, because in that Apostles' Creed it says Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate and died, and goes on. N.T. Wright says there's a comma there that has a huge gap. That his life wasn't an incident, it wasn't something of interest. His life had meaning an exemplar and how to follow him. And if you look at the people, the way you phrase the Passover, if you're going to be delivered from something, you must be under oppression. I mean, I don't need deliverance if I'm not under oppression. And there was so it looks to me like we were called to behavior, to play out our decision. You said, do you have to make a mind? Are you in Egypt or are you with the Jews? You got to make up your mind. And if you're in Egypt, you're the oppressors, or you're going to be, or you're fine. You don't need deliverance. If you're with the Jews, then you've got to embrace deliverance. And that seems to come up to us a lot of times. And if I embrace deliverance, then I'm going to behave in a certain way. As far as thinking alike, I've given up on that. None of us can think alike, but we can pretty much behave the same. We can agree upon how to treat people, how to live and stuff. And that's where I'm shifting to behavior in orthopraxy, as I brought up numerous times.
Right.
With this orthodoxy, correct thinking, because correct thinking just that's going to be a very problematic issue for us to have a form of tribe around correct thinking. It's difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Bill. Yeah, and Vince, thank you guys. Any other comments, fellas? Those are good comments for a session like this. So thank you. Yeah. Other ideas or questions?
I just thought it interesting. Bill and I we met at Starbucks as we do. Last week we were talking about a word that comes up a lot, synecdoche, and you brought it up, Mike, in your saying that blood represents the entire life of Jesus Christ.
Oh,
it's not the actual liquid that was spilled and not representing, and that liquid doesn't represent the liquid that was put on the lintel of the doorpost, but it's a grammatical figure of speech. It's a part meaning the whole, which is synecdoche, which I get to use in a sentence twice in one day. That's
I think
a form of metonymy.
I would love to hear more why you guys were talking about that, but we'll have to leave that for another, maybe a coffee or something. Other comments, fellas? Comments or questions?
I was wondering if you could quickly tell me why Calvinism is not part of your belief system for this particular discussion on verse 14.
Well, I think what Calvinism represents is a reformed idea, and there's a lot of value to that, but it's how you view it. There's, again, I got a few minutes here, Tatsi, but the idea of the elect and so forth, as it says in Scripture, what came to being through Calvin, Luther, and other reformers is the idea that some people are created by God to be elected to go to heaven, and others elected to hell. I believe in election because it's in the Scriptures, but I believe we are elected in and through Christ. He is the elect. He is everything. And what he has done for humanity through the incarnation, including the cross events, has everything to do with everything. Now, it's not that I don't, put cooties on Calvin. That's not the case. But Calvin had an interpretation of atonement. It's only one piece of what his theology is, of which there's several things I would embrace, but it was the idea of a legal transaction that God required a blood atonement. This is how he interpreted the New Testament and, well, the entire Bible, and that God required something and that Jesus satisfied that something. So if we accept that, then we can be set free. And I don't believe the cross. This is your answer right here. I don't believe the cross is to be viewed as a legal transaction. Now, it's very popular in our realm, and because it's easy to adopt. Oh, I get it. Jesus paid for my sin. I have a sin debt. Jesus paid it, and I accept it. It's an easy concept to accept, but I think the cross is more complex than that. And Calvin and then Luther were the ones that really went into that idea. I don't believe that God needed anything from in order to forgive. I don't I don't think that is an idea that was developed through atonement theories. And I think I understand the cross entirely from the love of God extending to humanity. Now, within that, there's a lot of mystery. And that's why we're talking about it here. I'm joining the ranks with everybody else. Of course, I like to read what other people have had to say. I think I can get smarter as I read other people. But I do have the choice, just like you do. I can adhere to it. I can buy it all. I can buy a portion of it, or I can reject that idea. With Calvin, I think Calvin has said some wonderful things in what he's done for the church, Luther then Calvin, but I don't share his view of a penal substitutionary atonement as that I was originally taught. Are you leaving?
I got an appointment. I got to get going.
Okay, it's 8:00.
See you guys.
With that statement, we're gonna have to shut down. But fellas, next week we're gonna look at what's happening in the crowd. We're gonna dial it down a little bit. I really felt it was important today to look at how the Jews of the New Testament and the early church viewed Passover, because it has huge bearing in this as we're looking at this super technical section. So anyway, have a good week, fellas, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Take care, everybody.
Yep. Good night, or not good night. Good morning.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
See you guys. See you next week.
See ya.